There's something about 3 in the morning that makes people tell the truth. When the world is asleep and the usual defenses are down, when darkness feels like a confessional, words emerge that daylight would never permit. This is a story about a family that learned this the hard way, when decades of carefully maintained silence fractured in a single night, and everything they thought they knew about each other became negotiable. By dawn, they were changed in ways they couldn't quite articulate, carrying the weight of confessions that couldn't be unsaid. Margaret and Robert had been married for 43 years. They had 3 adult children, 5 grandchildren, a house in the suburbs that they'd paid off, a life that looked like success from the outside. They attended church on Sundays, hosted holiday dinners, maintained the appearance of contentment that long marriages are supposed to embody. But contentment and truth are not always the same thing, and Margaret had been harboring a truth so significant that she'd never even told herself it fully. Their daughter Sarah called on a Wednesday evening to say she was bringing her family for a weekend visit. Margaret felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that had accompanied her children's visits for years, though she'd never articulated why. She spent Thursday cleaning the house obsessively, preparing guest rooms that would barely be used, cooking meals that required attention she couldn't properly give. Robert noticed her distraction, but didn't ask about it. After 43 years, he'd learned not to ask too many questions. Sarah arrived Friday afternoon with her husband Michael and their 2 children, Emma and Jack. The grandchildren ran through the house with the kind of unself-conscious joy that Margaret found both delightful and exhausting. Sarah had always been the difficult child, the one who questioned things, who didn't accept easy answers. She'd become a therapist, which Margaret found ironic given how little Sarah seemed to apply her professional expertise to her own family. That evening, they had dinner together, and conversation followed the usual patterns. Michael talked about his new job at the software company. Sarah mentioned a difficult client case she'd been working on. The children described their school week. Robert made jokes that were greeted with polite laughter. Margaret participated but felt distant, as if watching the dinner from outside her own body. She kept thinking about something, trying to suppress it, but the thought kept rising to the surface, like something that wouldn't stay submerged. After the children were put to bed, the adults lingered in the living room. They drank coffee that was probably too late in the day, discussed politics and local gossip and the usual neutral topics that families use to avoid saying anything that matters. Margaret excused herself to get dessert she'd prepared, and in the kitchen alone, she stood still for a moment, leaning against the counter, feeling something building inside her like pressure behind a dam. When she returned with the cake, she set it down on the table and remained standing rather than sitting. Everyone looked up at her, sensing something in her posture. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, and the words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise everyone else. Robert's face shifted, became alert. Sarah straightened in her chair. Michael glanced at Sarah uncertainly. "Sit down, Mom," Sarah said gently, as if Margaret were the client in one of her therapy sessions. Margaret didn't sit. She stood there, shaking slightly, and began to speak. She told them that she'd been unhappy in her marriage for most of its duration. Not in a dramatic way, but in the bone-deep way that accumulates over decades. She said it wasn't Robert's fault particularly, but rather that they'd married too young before either of them understood what they actually needed. Robert's face went very still. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. Margaret said she was saying that she'd stayed in the marriage because that's what people did, because leaving would have been complicated, because she had children, because she didn't know how to articulate unhappiness in a way that justified leaving someone who loved her. She said it felt like living inside a story she hadn't chosen, and the weight of that had only grown heavier with time. Sarah was processing this in real time, her therapist's mind trying to organize what she was hearing. Michael looked profoundly uncomfortable, as if he'd stumbled into a conversation he had no business witnessing. "Why are you telling us this now?" Sarah asked. Margaret said she didn't know exactly, except that she was 72 years old, and she'd run out of time to pretend that the next chapter of her life would be different from the first. Robert stood up abruptly and left the room. They heard him go upstairs, heard his footsteps in their bedroom. Margaret sank into the chair he'd vacated and looked at her hands. "I'm sorry," she said to Sarah and Michael, and meant it, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. Sarah reached over and took her mother's hand. "It's okay," she said, though it clearly wasn't, though nothing about this was okay. After Margaret and Sarah had cleaned up the cake and dishes, Margaret went upstairs to their bedroom. Robert was sitting on the edge of the bed, still dressed, staring at the wall. "I'm sorry," Margaret said again. Robert didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. He said he'd always known, in some way, that Margaret wasn't entirely present in the marriage. He said he'd felt it constantly, that it was like being loved by someone who was only partially there. Margaret sat beside him and they sat in silence. Robert said he'd stayed because he did love her, because leaving seemed harder than staying, because he didn't know how to live alone. He said he'd had his own unhappiness, but he'd learned to live with it, to make peace with it. He said that Margaret's confession made him feel simultaneously seen and invisible, finally understood, and hopelessly alone. Margaret didn't know what to say to that. Downstairs, Sarah was trying to sleep in the guest room but couldn't. She kept thinking about her mother, about how many years Margaret had spent unhappy, about what that meant for Sarah's own marriage, her own choices. She got up and went to the kitchen and made tea she didn't particularly want, needing something to do with her hands. Michael found her there and sat with her without speaking, which Sarah was grateful for. Around 2 a.m, Margaret came downstairs, unable to sleep. She found Sarah in the kitchen and they sat together in the silence of the sleeping house. Sarah asked her mother the questions she'd been formulating. Why hadn't she left if she was so unhappy? What did this mean for her and Robert now? Had Margaret considered that staying unhappy might have impacted Sarah's own sense of what was acceptable in relationships? Margaret answered slowly, carefully. She said that leaving would have meant being alone, which had seemed terrifying at the time. She said that she'd hoped things would improve, that she'd hoped she'd eventually feel differently. She said she'd protected her children from knowing about her unhappiness because she believed that was her job as a mother. And when Sarah asked if she regretted that protection, Margaret said yes and no simultaneously, which was the truest answer she could give. Sarah asked why her mother was telling her this now, really. Margaret said that watching her daughter live her own life, seeing Sarah struggle with some of the same questions about fulfillment and commitment, had made her realize that silence wasn't protection. Silence was just silence, and it left people to make their own mistakes without the benefit of understanding what those mistakes might cost. By 3 a.m, Robert had come downstairs too, drawn by voices he heard while lying awake in their bedroom. He found Margaret and Sarah in the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment before joining them. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Robert began to speak. He confessed that he'd had an affair 15 years ago, something that Margaret didn't know about. It had lasted 3 months and ended when Robert realized how much it would hurt Margaret if she discovered it. Margaret absorbed this information without shock, which somehow made it worse. She said she'd suspected something but had talked herself out of it, had decided not to know rather than to ask. Robert said that was the pattern of their marriage, both of them choosing not to know, not to ask, maintaining the surface while the foundation crumbled. He said he'd felt guilty about the affair, but he'd also felt that Margaret wouldn't really care, because caring required engagement that Margaret had never fully offered. Sarah listened to this and understood, with the clarity that comes from 3 a.m. conversations, that her parents' marriage had been a project of mutual avoidance. They'd been so focused on not hurting each other that they'd ended up harming each other constantly through the damage that secrets do. She saw her mother's face and realized that Margaret was grieving her marriage even while still in it, mourning what it had never been and what it now never would be. Margaret asked Robert if he'd been happy at any point, and Robert said yes, actually, at the beginning. The first few years had been good. They'd had sex that meant something, conversations that went somewhere, hope about their future. But at some point, Robert couldn't pinpoint when, the hope had faded and been replaced by routine. They'd built a life together, and the building of it had become a substitute for the living of it. They talked about what happened next. Did they divorce? Did they try to salvage something from the ruins? Did they continue as they had been, now with the knowledge that both of them had been unhappy? No one had answers. Robert said he didn't think he could leave Margaret now after so many years. Margaret said she didn't know if she could leave either, which felt different than saying she wouldn't. It was the difference between inability and reluctance, and neither was particularly comforting. Sarah suggested that maybe they didn't have to decide tonight. that maybe they could think about what came next with the clarity that morning would bring. Margaret said that morning would bring the same questions, but without the strange honesty that 3 in the morning afforded. Once daylight came, they'd probably go back to not talking about it, to maintaining the surface, to pretending this conversation hadn't happened. But Robert surprised them by saying he didn't want to go back to that. He said that having said these things out loud, he couldn't pretend they'd been unsaid. He said he wanted to try something different, though he didn't know what that would look like. Margaret said she'd been thinking about seeing a therapist, not for the marriage necessarily, but for herself. She said she'd spent her entire adult life conforming to what she thought she was supposed to be, and she wanted to know who she actually was. As dawn approached, the conversation wound down naturally, exhaustion setting in alongside a kind of resignation. They'd opened a door that couldn't be closed, had exposed truth that couldn't be reburied. The impact of it would unfold over months and years, not resolved in a single night, but initiated in one. They made more tea because they were tired and needed something warm to hold on to, and they sat together in the growing light. Robert and Margaret eventually did go to a therapist, together and separately. The process was painful and slow, and the outcome was uncertain. They didn't divorce, but they didn't reconcile either in any traditional sense. They renegotiated their marriage, learning to communicate about things they'd previously avoided, building something different from what they'd had before. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, which was better than what they'd managed before. Sarah returned to her own life with a different perspective on her parents' marriage and her own. She talked more honestly with Michael about what she wanted, what she needed, what she was willing to accept. She became a better therapist because of what she'd witnessed in her parents, understanding viscerally that people stayed in situations for reasons far more complex than simple choice. Emma and Jack never heard about the 3 in the morning confessions, but they noticed that their grandparents seemed different on subsequent visits. There was a kind of awkwardness between Robert and Margaret that hadn't been there before, but also something that resembled genuine connection rather than practiced performance. The children sensed that something had shifted, though they wouldn't understand it until they were adults themselves and capable of comprehending the weight of adult relationships. I want to thank you for journeying with me through this story of truth told in darkness, of families learning that silence is a kind of lie and that honesty, even when it's painful, is sometimes the only path forward. If this chronicle has resonated with you, if you've experienced your own 3 in the morning confessions or recognized the weight of secrets held in families, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel and become a member. Your support allows us to continue sharing these stories about the interior lives of families, about the moments when truth can no longer be suppressed, about how we learn to live with what we've revealed. Join our community, and help us explore the complex landscape of family bonds, where love and unhappiness coexist, and where the darkest hours sometimes bring the clearest light.